The Second World War ended in 1945, but its echoes continue to shape how we view history. Few figures have been studied more than Adolf Hitler, and few places have been examined more intensely than the Führerbunker in Berlin, where the Nazi regime collapsed in its final hours. But while historians and filmmakers have pieced together the story from documents and testimony, only a handful of men and women actually lived inside that bunker during those final desperate weeks. One of them was Rochus Misch, who was Hitler's bodyguard, telephonist, and courier. In this video, we examine Misch's journey from his orphan childhood to his entry into Hitler's innermost staff, his long silence, and finally, his decision to tell his story. But behind the cold facts of war lies a man whose life mirrored Germany's darkest years. How did an orphaned boy grow into Hitler's most trusted shadow inside the bunker's walls? Who was Rochus Misch? Rochus Misch was born on July 29, 1917, in Alt-Schalkowitz, Upper Silesia, a region that was then part of Germany, but is today within Poland's borders. His early years were marked by hardship. His father, a soldier during the First World War, was killed in action. His mother passed away soon after. Orphaned as a young boy, Misch was raised by his grandparents. Like many Germans of his generation, he grew up amid political unrest, economic instability, and the lingering wounds of a war that had devastated Europe. The 1920s in Germany were a time of turmoil. The Weimar Republic struggled with hyperinflation, political extremism, and social fragmentation. By the time Misch entered his teenage years, Adolf Hitler and the Nazi Party were gaining traction with promises of national renewal and stability. To young men from modest, uncertain backgrounds, the regime offered structure, employment, and belonging. As a young adult, Misch gravitated toward military life. He eventually joined the Leibstandarte SS Adolf Hitler, the elite SS unit originally created as Hitler's personal bodyguard, but later expanded into a full combat division. Service in the SS was demanding. Misch trained not only as a soldier, but also in courier and communications work roles that required reliability and discretion. When Germany invaded Poland in 1939, Misch was deployed as part of the LSSAH. He took part in frontline fighting during the opening campaigns of the war. At one point, he was badly wounded in action, an injury that ended his combat service. This setback, however, became a turning point. While recovering, he was reassigned to a new role, one that would bring him directly into Hitler's personal staff. But fate had other plans for Misch. His wound would close one chapter and open another, placing him closer to the Nazi leader than almost anyone else. What secrets awaited him? Entering Hitler's inner circle. By 1940, Rochus Misch had been selected for one of the most sensitive positions in the Third Reich, a place on Adolf Hitler's personal staff. This was not a posting to the front lines or a promotion to a grand military command. Instead, it was an assignment into a world that very few people were ever permitted to enter, the tight, carefully controlled circle that surrounded the Führer at all times. The men who served in this detail were chosen with the utmost scrutiny. They had to be young, disciplined, and above all, loyal. Silence was not just expected, but demanded, for the work exposed them to information, routines, and personalities that could never be shared outside the group. Misch's duties were varied, though each role was tied directly to Hitler's safety and efficiency. First and foremost, he was a bodyguard. Whether Hitler was traveling by train, by car, or moving between his many residences and military headquarters, Misch and his colleagues ensured that no threat could approach too closely. Every entrance was guarded, every route inspected, and every moment accounted for. Misch later recalled that this was not glamorous work. It was exhausting, repetitive, and often invisible, the kind of protection where success was measured by nothing happening at all. Beyond the role of protector, Misch also served as a courier. Sensitive documents had to be carried across Germany and the occupied territories, and this could not be entrusted to just anyone. Misch often traveled under orders to deliver sealed messages, sometimes to generals in the field, sometimes to Nazi officials in distant offices. In an age when telephones could be intercepted and radio signals decrypted, a trusted courier was often the only way to guarantee secrecy. Misch himself would never know the content of the papers he carried, but he understood their importance by the urgency with which he was dispatched. Perhaps his most defining duty, however, was as a telephonist. Hitler relied on a complex network of telephones and lines that linked him with commanders, ministers, and foreign leaders. Misch was responsible for ensuring those connections worked, for patching calls through, and for making sure communications were secure. This role anchored him at the very hub of Hitler's daily operations. While Misch never took part in the conversations, he was close enough to hear voices, recognize names, and sense the urgency of the discussions. In many ways, he functioned like a shadow, present but not participating, watching history unfold from just beyond the spotlight. Living in such proximity to Hitler gave Misch a perspective unlike that of soldiers at the front or civilians in German cities. He was not part of the decision-making elite, but he ate in the same compounds, walked the same halls, and sometimes shared the same cramped quarters as the men who directed the war. He accompanied Hitler to his field headquarters, such as the Wolf's Lair in East Prussia, and later settled inside the Reich Chancellery in Berlin. From these positions, he saw the Führer not as a distant figure on posters or radio broadcasts, but as a flesh-and-blood man with habits, moods, and routines. Misch later described Hitler in terms that astonished many who heard him. In his recollections, the dictator was punctual, disciplined, and surprisingly polite with the staff who served him day after day. Misch painted a portrait that contrasted sharply with the screaming, arm-waving orator captured in propaganda films. In private, Hitler could be quiet, reserved, and even, at times, considerate. To his bodyguards and aides, he appeared more like an employer than the embodiment of terror that the world knew him to be. It was this disparity between Misch's personal impressions and Hitler's public image that became one of the most debated aspects of his later testimony. But if Hitler seemed so ordinary to those closest to him, what truly unfolded in the daily rhythms of his inner circle? Could routine habits reveal more than history admits? Daily life around Hitler. Misch's testimony about daily life around Hitler offers rare glimpses behind closed doors. Hitler typically rose late in the day, sometimes near midday. His breakfast was light tea, bread, or simple vegetarian meals. He avoided alcohol and tobacco entirely, a fact that Misch often emphasized. Afternoons were dedicated to military briefings. Generals laid out maps, discussed troop movements, and updated him on battles across Europe. Misch, stationed at the telephones, handled incoming and outgoing calls. While he did not always grasp the full content of the conversations, he observed the seriousness and tension that permeated them. Evenings were more relaxed. Hitler often gathered with secretaries and aides to watch films, listen to music, or discuss topics such as architecture, art, or history. Misch remembered these gatherings as surprisingly ordinary. Hitler, he said, could be courteous and even fatherly toward his female staff, though he remained distant and formal with others. What Misch insisted he did not hear were open discussions of the Holocaust or extermination policies. He maintained that his role kept him outside the regime's inner political deliberations. Critics have challenged this, arguing that it strains credibility for someone so close to the Führer to have been ignorant of the mass killings. Historians generally accept that while Misch may not have been directly informed, it is improbable that he was entirely unaware. Within Hitler's residences and headquarters, strict hierarchy prevailed. Everyone addressed Hitler formally. Interruptions were unthinkable, and orders were executed immediately. Misch's description of his own role was passive: to guard, to connect calls, to remain in the background. He likened himself to a servant or attendant, always present, but never central. As the war dragged into 1944 and 1945, the atmosphere shifted. Where once there had been confidence, now there was tension and despair. Reports from the front were bleak. The Allies advanced from both west and east, and Germany's resources dwindled. Misch sensed the growing anxiety in the bunker and among staff even as Hitler clung to routine. But as the world outside closed in, the walls within seemed to tighten. What awaited inside this underground fortress would reveal the final unraveling, what truly happened in Hitler's last refuge, the final bunker days. In January 1945, Hitler permanently relocated to the Führerbunker beneath the Reich Chancellery in Berlin. This underground fortress was meant to withstand bombing and artillery, but life inside was grim. The bunker contained offices, conference rooms, and living quarters, but its narrow corridors and constant pressure created a stifling environment. Misch was assigned to the Communications Center, a critical hub linking Hitler with the outside world. From his post, he connected calls to frontline generals, field commanders, and Nazi officials across Germany. As Soviet troops closed in, these calls grew increasingly desperate. Commanders pleaded for reinforcements that did not exist, while local leaders reported chaos as cities fell one by one. Inside the bunker, notable figures joined Hitler for the end. Joseph Goebbels and his family, Eva Braun, Martin Bormann, and several secretaries. Staff continued to perform daily tasks, preparing meals, maintaining records, and answering phones even as the ground above shook from constant Soviet bombardment. Misch later described Hitler in these final weeks as a frail and diminished figure. Yet he still held briefings, received reports, and issued orders, though his energy was clearly fading. Rumors of escape circulated among staff. Some speculated about flights to Bavaria, others about daring escapes abroad. But the reality was grim. Berlin was encircled, and escape was virtually impossible. Misch himself felt bound to his duty. He remained at his station answering phones even as the regime crumbled around him. But then came the moment everyone had dreaded. The whispers stopped. The tension reached its peak. What would unfold in that bunker's final hours? And how would the world change forever? The death of Hitler. April 30th, 1945, brought the moment that had loomed over the bunker for weeks. According to Misch, he was in the communications room when the news arrived. He did not witness the act, but soon an aide informed him and others that Hitler was dead. Eyewitness accounts corroborated by surviving staff confirm that Hitler shot himself in his private quarters while Eva Braun took cyanide. Misch accepted this version, though he emphasized he only received the news secondhand. The announcement sent shockwaves through the bunker. Some staff wept, others sat in stunned silence. Soon Hitler's final instructions were carried out. His body and Eva Braun's were taken to the garden outside, doused in petrol, and set alight. The event marked the collapse of the central figure that had dominated their lives for more than a decade. Misch later explained that the mood was not one of relief, but of disorientation. The chain of command had broken. Officers argued about who should lead, while others simply tried to find a way to escape. Fear of Soviet capture haunted them as rumors circulated about atrocities committed against German soldiers and civilians. For many inside, the thought of suicide was more appealing than falling into enemy hands. Misch's own perspective remained that of an observer. He had no political power and no say in decisions, but he watched as some of Hitler's closest aides wrestled with the reality that their world had ended. In interviews decades later, he recalled the surreal atmosphere. Telephones still rang, orders were still passed, yet everyone knew there was nothing left to fight for. For the next 2 days, Misch remained at his post. Telephones continued to ring, though there was little left to say. On May 2, 1945, Soviet forces stormed the Reich Chancellery and the bunker, capturing the survivors. For Rochus Misch, the war ended not with surrender, but with capture, as the last echoes of a regime crumbled around him. But survival inside the bunker was only the beginning of Misch's ordeal. What awaited him beyond its walls was harsher, colder, and far more uncertain. How long could he endure? Capture and prison years. Misch's capture marked the beginning of nearly a decade in Soviet hands. The Red Army, determined to confirm Hitler's death and dismantle any rumors of escape, interrogated every surviving staff member. Misch, as Hitler's telephonist, was considered a valuable witness. He was transported eastward, eventually entering the Soviet prison camp system. Conditions were brutal. The winters were bitterly cold. Food was scarce, medical care was minimal, and overcrowding was severe. Like countless other German prisoners of war, Misch endured hunger, disease, and forced labor. Many prisoners did not survive. For 9 years, Misch remained in captivity. He was interrogated repeatedly about Hitler's final days, about the bunker, and about Nazi leadership. His answers were not only of interest to Soviet intelligence, but also to Soviet propaganda, which sought to control the narrative of the war's end. Finally, in 1953, following the death of Joseph Stalin, many German prisoners were released as part of a broader political thaw. Misch returned to Berlin, now divided into East and West. He reunited with his wife Gerda and began rebuilding his life. Later life and public silence. Back in West Berlin, Misch opened a small painting and interior decoration business. He sought anonymity in the post-war years, while other former SS members became politically active or tried to justify their pasts. Misch chose silence. For decades, he refused interviews. He explained that he wanted to live in peace and feared the reaction his story might provoke. To neighbors and acquaintances, he was simply a tradesman. Even his daughter grew up largely unaware of the full extent of his wartime role. Behind this quiet life, however, Misch carried memories that few others possessed. He had been in the bunker during Hitler's final hours. He had seen the dictator daily, connected his calls, and observed the collapse of the regime from inside its walls. Yet for nearly half a century, he kept those experiences to himself. What made Misch unusual was his absolute reluctance to insert himself into public debate. Germany in the post-war years was filled with memoirs from generals, politicians, and propagandists, each seeking to explain their version of events. Misch, by contrast, avoided both justification and condemnation. Friends recalled that he rarely spoke about the war at all, and when pressed, he would quietly change the subject. His silence reflected not only caution, but also a desire to avoid reliving the trauma of those years. In a country struggling to come to terms with its past, Misch preferred to bury his own, living a modest existence while history moved on without his voice. But silence never lasts forever. When Misch finally broke it, the world leaned in. What stories had he guarded so tightly, and why choose to reveal them now? Breaking his silence. Book and interviews. It was not until the early 2000s that Misch began to speak publicly. By then, he was one of the very last surviving members of Hitler's immediate staff. Historians and journalists were eager to capture his testimony before it was lost. Misch appeared in interviews and documentaries, often recounting his memories with calm detachment. In 2008, he published his memoir, Der letzte Zeuge. Translated into multiple languages, the book attracted global attention. In it, Misch described his service in detail, the routines, the bunker atmosphere, and the final days. He portrayed Hitler as a disciplined and polite man in private, even affectionate toward his secretaries. He denied ever hearing about the Holocaust or mass killings, claiming his duties kept him apart from such matters. He insisted that he was a soldier, not a politician, and that he bore no direct responsibility for Nazi crimes. The response was deeply divided. Some readers valued the first-hand account, seeing it as a unique piece of testimony from the last man standing. Others condemned Misch for evasion and denial, arguing that his memoir minimized the regime's atrocities. Holocaust survivors and their families expressed anger at his refusal to acknowledge what was happening around him. Historians regarded the book cautiously. They found value in his specific descriptions of the bunker, but noted the limitations of his selective memory. For them, Misch's testimony was useful for reconstructing certain details, but it could not be treated as a complete or unbiased record. Controversy and legacy. Rochus Misch remained unapologetic until his death. He repeatedly stated that he had no regrets about serving as Hitler's guard, emphasizing that he had simply performed his duty as a soldier. This stance ensured that controversy surrounded him. For critics, Misch symbolized the refusal of many Germans to confront their past honestly. His unwillingness to acknowledge the Holocaust or admit awareness of Nazi crimes was seen as a form of denial. For others, his testimony was valuable precisely because it reflected the perspective of someone who lived close to power, yet claimed ignorance of its darkest deeds. When Misch died on September 5, 2013 at the age of 96, newspapers around the world noted the passing of the last witness. With him, a direct human link to Hitler's bunker was severed. His life story remains a source of debate. Was he an innocent bystander caught in history's machinery, or was his ignorance willful, a refusal to see what was before his eyes? His testimony continues to be cited in documentaries and books. It serves as a reminder of how memory, denial, and responsibility intertwine in the legacy of the Second World War. Misch's words give us details of Hitler's final days, but they also highlight the limits of personal testimony when it collides with history's darkest truths. Rochus Misch's story forces us to wrestle with uncomfortable questions about memory and responsibility. He was not a general or a policymaker. He was a bodyguard, a courier, a telephonist. Yet fate placed him in Hitler's inner circle during the last chapter of the Third Reich. Was he truthful, or was he hiding behind selective memory? Did he fail to see, or did he refuse to admit? Each of us must weigh his testimony carefully. What is certain is that Misch provided a rare human perspective from inside the bunker. Thank you for watching. If you found this exploration meaningful, please subscribe and join us as we uncover more stories from history's hidden corners.